If they were normally at a slight distance or living down the road or just, whether it be 15 minutes.
For years, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, chose silence. While the world debated the royal rift, she remained Buckingham Palace's ultimate vault. Until now. Breaking her legendary silence on Meghan Markle, the Duchess has delivered a statement that didn't just break protocol, it sent absolute shockwaves through the royal ranks. Nobody inside the palace walls was ready for what came next. The silence that spoke for years. There is a particular kind of silence that is not passive. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say, not the silence of someone who has not been paying attention, but the silence of someone who has made a very deliberate, very calculated decision that the time to speak has not yet arrived. That is the silence Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, maintained for years whenever the subject of Meghan Markle came up. And in royal circles, where every word is weighed and every omission is noted, that silence was louder than most people realized. To understand why Sophie finally broke it, you have to understand what that silence cost her. Because it was not easy, it was not comfortable, and it was not, sources close to her confirm, a reflection of indifference. Sophie has been a member of the British royal family since 1999, when she married Prince Edward, the youngest son of Queen Elizabeth II. In the years that followed, she built a reputation that most royals spend their entire careers chasing and never quite catching. She became trusted, genuinely, deeply, institutionally trusted. By the Queen, by senior courtiers, by the public. She did it the old-fashioned way, through consistency, through discretion, through showing up without drama, and doing the work without complaint. She also did it by knowing when to stay quiet. When Meghan Markle arrived in the royal family in 2017, Sophie watched. She observed the way Meghan moved through the institution. She noted the friction that began emerging almost immediately between Meghan's team and the palace's established structures. She registered the tensions that were building behind the scenes long before they became public knowledge. And she said nothing publicly, not a word of criticism, not a whisper of concern, nothing. When the Oprah interview landed in March 2021 and detonated across the global media landscape, Sophie watched again. She watched the palace scramble. She watched William's jaw tighten, in that particular way it does when he is containing something significant. She watched Charles navigate the impossible position of responding to allegations made by his own son and daughter-in-law on international television. And still she said nothing publicly about Meghan. When the Netflix documentary arrived in December 2022, when Harry's memoir Spare hit bookshelves in January 2023, when allegation after allegation emerged about life inside the royal family, Sophie maintained her position, composed, measured, silent on the specific subject of Meghan Markle. People noticed, journalists asked, interviewers probed, and Sophie deflected every single time with the practiced grace of someone who has spent decades mastering the art of saying nothing while appearing to say something. So why now? What changed between then and early 2026 that finally moved Sophie from silence to speech? The answer involves several things happening simultaneously, and the first of them is the shift in the institutional atmosphere inside the palace itself. By early 2026, the royal family was navigating one of the most turbulent periods in its recent history. Prince Andrew's arrest in February 2026 on charges connected to the Epstein network had sent shockwaves through the institution. King Charles was managing his cancer treatment while simultaneously trying to maintain the visible stability of his reign. William had stepped into an increasingly prominent decision-making role, and the question of Harry and Meghan's relationship with the crown had moved from a background tension into something more immediate and more consequential. Because Harry had not been silent during all of this, sources confirm that, behind the scenes, Harry had been making approaches to the palace about his position, about his security arrangements, about the possibility of some form of reconciliation, or at least rapprochement with the institution he had left. Those conversations had not gone well. And some of the reasons they had not gone well connected directly to positions Meghan had taken publicly in the preceding months. In late 2025, Meghan had relaunched her public profile with a series of carefully orchestrated media appearances. She had given interviews. She had made statements. She had positioned herself with considerable skill as a wronged woman who had tried her best and been failed by an institution that was not ready for her. The narrative was polished. The messaging was consistent, and inside the palace, it landed like a lit match on dry ground. Because the people inside that palace had their own memories of what had happened, They had their own accounts of the meetings that had taken place, the conversations that had occurred, the moments where things had gone wrong and why. And for years, they had maintained their silence, while the public narrative was shaped almost entirely by one side of the story. Sophie had watched all of this with the same careful attention she brought to everything. She had watched Meghan's media relaunch. She had listened to the interviews. She had noted the specific claims being made and measured them against her own knowledge of what had actually happened during those years. And something in her had shifted, not into anger. Sophie does not operate from anger, but into a quiet, firm conviction that silence had its limits. That there was a point at which staying quiet stopped being dignified restraint and started being something closer to complicity. Complicity in a narrative she believed was incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. That conviction had been building for months, and then something specific happened in January 2026 that pushed it from a private feeling into a public act. Something that involved a specific claim Meghan had made, a specific person that claim affected, and a specific moment where Sophie decided that this particular thing could not go unanswered. What was that claim? Who did it affect? And what exactly did Sophie say when she finally decided to speak? That is where this story gets genuinely significant. Keep watching. What Sophie actually said. The moment itself was not staged. That is the first thing you need to understand about how Sophie's remarks emerged. This was not a carefully planned press offensive. It was not a coordinated palace communication strategy designed to push back against Meghan's media relaunch. It did not come with a publicist in the room or a carefully worded statement reviewed by 3 layers of courtiers before it was released into the world. It came from a private gathering, a small, intimate dinner held in London in the second week of January 2026. The kind of event that happens regularly in the upper circles of British society, a gathering of no more than 20 people. A mix of long-standing friends, cultural figures, and individuals connected to several of the charitable causes Sophie champions. The kind of evening where conversation flows freely because everyone present understands implicitly that what is said in the room stays in the room. Except that this time, it did not stay in the room. Within 48 hours of the dinner, fragments of what Sophie had said began circulating in the specific narrow channels where royal information travels before it reaches the press. By the end of that week, 2 senior royal correspondents had been briefed, and by the time the palace became aware that something had leaked, the story was already beyond containment. So, what did Sophie actually say? Sources who were present at the dinner, or who were directly briefed by people who were, describe a conversation that began as a broader discussion about the challenges facing the monarchy, and gradually became something more specific. Someone at the table raised the subject of Meghan's recent media appearances, the interviews, the carefully constructed narrative of victimhood and institutional failure, and Sophie, who had been listening quietly, put down her glass and spoke. She did not shout. She did not perform. She spoke in the measured, precise tone that people who know her recognize as the voice she uses when she has thought very carefully about something and is now prepared to say it clearly. She said that she had a great deal of respect for anyone who found royal life difficult, that it was genuinely hard, that the scrutiny was relentless and the pressure was real, and she would not minimize any of that for anyone. But she also said that there was a significant difference between finding something difficult and deliberately misrepresenting it, and that the misrepresentation had consequences. Real consequences for real people who had no platform to correct the record. She then said something more specific, something that sources describe as the moment the room went completely still. She addressed directly a claim that Meghan had made during one of her late 2025 interviews. A claim about the way senior members of the royal family had responded to concerns Meghan said she had raised about her mental health during her time as a working royal. Meghan had suggested in that interview that she had reached out to people close to the family and been met with silence, that nobody had checked on her, that she had felt completely alone inside an institution that surrounded her with staff but offered her no genuine human support. Sophie's response to that claim, according to multiple sources present at the dinner, was direct and unambiguous. She said that was not true. She said she personally had reached out to Meghan on more than one occasion during the period Meghan was describing. She said those conversations had happened and that she had records of them. She said that the characterization of silence and abandonment did not reflect the reality of what had actually taken place. And she said that she had stayed quiet about this for years, out of respect for the complexity of the situation, and out of a genuine reluctance to make a painful family matter worse. But that watching a false account of events be presented repeatedly to a global audience as established fact had become something she was no longer willing to accept without correction. She was calm throughout. Nobody present describes raised voices or visible emotion. Just a woman who had decided that a specific thing needed to be said and was saying it with complete clarity. The effect on the room was immediate. Several guests described feeling the weight of what they had just heard settle over the table. This was not gossip. This was not a frustrated aside or an unguarded moment of irritation. This was a considered, specific, evidenced rebuttal from one of the most credible and respected members of the royal family, delivered quietly, in private, with the stated intention of correcting a record that Sophie believed had been deliberately distorted. What nobody at that dinner fully anticipated was how quickly it would travel. The leak, when it came, was not a verbatim transcript. It was a summary. An account of what had been said passed from one person to another until it reached the ears of people with connections to the royal press. But even in summary form, the impact was significant, because the core of what Sophie had said was clear enough. She had directly contradicted a specific claim made by Meghan Markle. She had done so on the basis of personal knowledge and personal records, and she had broken the silence she had maintained for years to do it. Inside the palace, the reaction was a mixture of understanding and anxiety. Understanding because most of the people inside that institution had their own version of Sophie's frustration, their own memories of what had actually happened during those years, their own quiet anger at watching a narrative take hold that they believed was fundamentally incomplete. Anxiety because the moment a senior royal speaks on the record, even in a private setting, about Meghan Markle, the institutional consequences are unpredictable and significant. William was briefed within 24 hours of the leak reaching the press. Sources describe his response as measured. He did not criticize Sophie. He did not express concern about the leak itself. What he said, according to a source familiar with the conversation, was simply that Sophie had every right to correct a false account of her own actions. That nobody should be required to stay silent indefinitely while their behavior was misrepresented, and that the palace would not be issuing any statement either endorsing or distancing itself from what she had said. That last part was the most significant. The palace's decision not to distance itself from Sophie's remarks was itself a statement, a quiet but unmistakable signal that the institution was not unhappy that this particular correction had finally been made. Meghan's team, as of the time this story broke, had not issued any public response. The silence from that side was noted immediately by royal watchers, who understand that in the carefully managed world of celebrity communications, silence is never accidental. It is a decision. And the decision not to respond directly to Sophie's remarks suggests that Meghan's team recognized something important. Sophie had not spoken carelessly. She had spoken with evidence, and challenging someone who has evidence is a very different proposition from challenging someone who has only an opinion. But what is the full history between these two women? Because Sophie's remarks did not emerge from nowhere. They emerged from years of observation, interaction, and a relationship that was far more complex than the public ever fully understood. The history between these two women. To understand the full weight of what Sophie said at that January dinner, you have to go back to the beginning, back to the moment Meghan Markle first stepped into the orbit of the British royal family, and the two women found themselves navigating the same complicated institutional landscape from very different starting points. When Meghan arrived on the scene in 2017, Sophie was already 17 years into her royal life. 17 years of learning the unwritten rules, absorbing the institutional culture, and building the reputation that had taken her from a nervous young woman at her own wedding to one of the most trusted and respected figures in the entire family. She had not arrived at that position easily. Her early years as a royal had come with their own very public difficulties. A business scandal in 2001 had briefly threatened to derail everything she had worked to build. She had navigated it with the kind of quiet resilience that became the defining characteristic of her royal identity. So, when Meghan arrived, full of energy and ambition, and a very clear sense of her own vision for what her royal role should look like, Sophie did not view her with suspicion or hostility. Sources close to her are consistent on this point. Sophie's initial response to Meghan was genuine warmth and a sincere desire to be helpful. She remembered what it felt like to be new. She remembered the disorientation of entering an institution with centuries of unwritten rules and no instruction manual. And she made a deliberate effort to extend to Meghan the kind of quiet support she wished she had received herself in those early years. The two women met privately on several occasions during 2017 and 2018. Sophie offered what sources describe as practical guidance, not lectures about tradition or warnings about the press. Practical, specific, genuinely useful advice about how to manage the relentless public schedule, how to build relationships with the household staff, who would become essential allies, and how to find moments of genuine privacy inside a life that was almost entirely public. Meghan, by most accounts from people present during that period, received that guidance politely. She was warm in return. She was engaged. But there was also, sources note, a sense that she had already formed very clear ideas about how she wanted to approach her royal role, and that those ideas did not always align with the institutional wisdom Sophie was offering. That divergence was not immediately a source of tension. People approach things differently. New ideas are not always wrong. And Sophie, who is not a rigid traditionalist by any measure, was genuinely open to the possibility that Meghan's fresher perspective might bring something valuable to an institution that had not always been good at evolving. But by the middle of 2018, something had begun to shift. The friction that was emerging between Meghan's office and the wider palace structure was becoming harder to ignore. Stories were beginning to circulate internally about difficult interactions, about staff members feeling undermined, about decisions being made unilaterally that cut across established household protocols. Sophie was aware of these stories. She heard them from people she trusted, and she began to notice a gap opening up between the Meghan she had met in those early private conversations and the institutional reality that was developing around her. She did not take sides publicly. She did not brief against Meghan or add her voice to what was becoming, in certain palace corridors, a growing chorus of concern. She maintained her position, warm, measured, and carefully neutral in any forum where her words might be reported or repeated. But she was watching, and she was forming conclusions. The Oprah interview in March 2021 was a turning point for Sophie in a way that has never been fully reported. Not because of the broader allegations about the royal family and race and institutional failure, but because of something more specific. During that interview and in the media coverage that surrounded it, claims were made about the response of senior royals to Meghan's struggles during her time as a working royal. Claims about silence and abandonment, and a failure of human care from the people closest to the institution. Sophie heard those claims and recognized immediately that they touched on interactions she had personally been part of, conversations she had personally initiated, moments of outreach she had personally extended. And she sat with the knowledge that a version of events was being presented to a global audience of millions that did not match her own lived experience of what had happened. She chose silence, for reasons that were partly personal, partly institutional, and partly a genuine uncertainty about whether speaking would help, or simply add more noise to an already deafening situation. That silence held through the Netflix documentary. It held through the publication of Spare. It held through every subsequent media appearance and every carefully crafted narrative about life inside the royal family. For nearly 5 years, Sophie carried what she knew and said nothing. What eroded that silence was not a single dramatic moment, but an accumulation. Every time the same claims were repeated, every time the narrative of abandonment and institutional indifference was presented as settled fact, something in Sophie tightened a little further. Every interview, every documentary, every carefully worded statement from Meghan's team that allowed the impression of royal coldness and neglect to deepen in the public mind. By the time Meghan's late 2025 media relaunch arrived, Sophie had been carrying 5 years of contradicting knowledge in complete silence. 5 years of watching a story be told that she believed left out the parts that mattered most. 5 years of respecting a discretion that was, she had finally concluded, no longer serving anyone well. The dinner in January 2026 was not a planned intervention, but it was not entirely accidental either. Sophie had reached the end of something, and when the moment came, she did not hesitate. The question now is what the palace does with the fallout, and what William's visible silence on the matter actually signals about where the institution stands. The palace scrambles, and William watches. When a story like this breaks inside royal circles, the first thing the palace does is assess. Not respond, not react. Assess. Who said what, to whom, in what context, how far has it traveled, who has been briefed, and most critically, what is the institutional cost of the various possible responses available to it. That assessment process began within hours of Sophie's remarks leaking out of that January dinner, and what made it unusually complicated was not the content of what Sophie had said. Most of the people inside the palace believed she was telling the truth. What made it complicated was the position it put the institution in. Because the palace does not, as a rule, engage in public back and forth with the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. It learned that lesson the hard way across several years of watching every response it made become ammunition for the next round of allegations. So, the communications team found itself in a genuinely difficult position. Sophie had said something specific, something evidenced, and something that directly contradicted a claim Meghan had made publicly. The instinct of every senior communications advisor in that building was to distance the institution from the remarks, to issue a careful statement emphasizing that Sophie had spoken in a private capacity, and to close down the story as quickly as possible. But there was a problem with that instinct, and the problem had a name: William. Sources confirm that when the communications team brought their recommended response strategy to William's office, they encountered resistance they had not anticipated. William did not shout it down. He did not issue a counter-instruction dramatically. He simply asked a question, a single, quiet question that stopped the conversation in its tracks. He asked why the palace should distance itself from a factual correction made by a senior royal about her own personal conduct. Nobody in the room had a satisfying answer to that question, because when you stripped away the institutional anxiety and the communications calculus, the answer was uncomfortable. The palace would be distancing itself from Sophie, not because she had said something wrong, but because saying something true had created a problem. And William, who has made institutional honesty the cornerstone of his vision for the monarchy's future, was not prepared to endorse that position. The statement that eventually emerged from the palace was therefore a masterpiece of carefully constructed neutrality. It acknowledged that Sophie had spoken in a private capacity. It declined to comment on the specific content of her remarks, and it said absolutely nothing that could be interpreted as a criticism of what she had said. In the language of royal communications, that non-distancing was as close to an endorsement as the institution was prepared to offer. Camilla's reaction to the entire situation was, according to sources, considerably less composed than William's. She had her own complicated history with the Sussex situation, her own reasons for finding the ongoing public narrative about royal family life deeply frustrating. But she was also acutely aware that any visible palace conflict involving Meghan had the potential to reignite exactly the kind of media storm that nobody inside the institution wanted to navigate, while simultaneously dealing with the fallout from Andrew's arrest and Charles's ongoing health challenges. She reportedly expressed concern to Charles that Sophie's remarks, however truthful, had handed the Sussex communications operation a new storyline: the narrative of a royal family closing ranks against Meghan, the story of senior royals finally dropping their masks and revealing the hostility that had apparently always been there beneath the carefully maintained surface of institutional neutrality. Charles listened. He did not disagree entirely with Camilla's concern, but he also did not, sources confirm, take any steps to formally rebuke Sophie or to ask her to issue a clarifying statement walking back what she had said. He understood, perhaps better than Camilla, that asking Sophie to retract a truthful account of her own actions would create a different and arguably worse problem. It would signal to every member of the royal household that the institution expected them to stay silent in the face of public misrepresentation indefinitely. And that signal, in the current climate, was one Charles was not prepared to send. Outside the palace, the reaction among royal watchers and media commentators was swift and revealing. Those who had long believed that the palace's silence on Sussex allegations reflected guilt rather than restraint seized on Sophie's remarks as evidence of a family finally fighting back. Those who were more sympathetic to Meghan's position argued that Sophie's comments were a coordinated attempt to undermine Meghan's credibility ahead of some anticipated future project or statement. Both interpretations missed the point. Sophie had not coordinated with anyone. She had not been briefed to speak. She had not been given a green light by a communications team or a nudge from a senior royal advisor. She had made a personal decision based on personal knowledge and personal conviction. And the palace's subsequent handling of the situation reflected not a coordinated strategy, but an institution trying to catch up with something it had not anticipated and could not fully control. What nobody was saying publicly, but everyone was thinking privately, was the question of what came next. Because Sophie's remarks had opened a door. Not dramatically, not irreversibly, but perceptibly. She had demonstrated that it was possible for a senior royal to directly contradict a Sussex narrative without the institution collapsing around them. She had shown that the wall of silence the palace had maintained for years was not load-bearing in the way everyone had assumed. And William had watched the whole thing unfold without blinking, without intervening to stop it, without rushing to manage the fallout in a way that protected the Sussex narrative at the expense of the truth. That stillness from William was not passive, it was a position. And it tells you everything you need to know about the direction this institution is heading, and whose version of events it intends to stand behind going forward. What that means for Meghan, for Harry, and for the future relationship between Sussex and the Crown is the final piece of this story, and it is not a comfortable conclusion for everyone involved. What this changes going forward. There is a moment in every long-running institutional conflict where the balance of power shifts. Not dramatically, not with a single defining event that everyone can point to and say that was the moment everything changed, but quietly, incrementally, through an accumulation of small decisions and small signals that together add up to something irreversible. Sophie's remarks at that January dinner were one of those signals. And to understand why they matter beyond the immediate headlines, you have to think carefully about what they actually changed inside the dynamic between the royal family and the Sussex operation. For years, the Sussex communication strategy had operated on a very specific assumption. That assumption was silence equals guilt. That the palace's refusal to publicly contradict allegations made by Harry and Meghan reflected an institutional acknowledgement that those allegations were at least partially true. Every time a claim was made and the palace stayed quiet, the silence was interpreted as confirmation. Not officially, not explicitly, but in the court of public opinion, which is ultimately the only court that matters for an institution whose power rests entirely on public consent, the effect was the same. Sophie had just punched a hole in that assumption. She had demonstrated that the silence had never been about guilt. It had been about restraint, a restraint that was chosen, not compelled. A restraint that individual members of the royal family were capable of setting aside when the specific circumstances demanded it, and a restraint that the palace, under William's quietly evolving leadership, was no longer going to enforce as an absolute institutional requirement. That is a fundamental shift, and Meghan's team understood it immediately, which is why they chose not to respond. Because responding would require either directly contradicting Sophie's account of their personal interactions, which would be dangerous given that Sophie had stated clearly she had records of those interactions, or implicitly acknowledging that Sophie's version had validity, which would undermine years of carefully constructed narrative. There was no good option, so they chose silence. And in doing so, they ceded the ground. For Harry, the situation is more complicated and more personally painful. His attempts to negotiate some form of rapprochement with the palace have not produced the outcomes he had hoped for. His relationship with William remains frozen in a way that sources close to both men describe as unlikely to thaw in any meaningful way in the near future. And now the woman who had been arguably the most genuinely warm and supportive senior royal toward both Harry and Meghan during their working royal years has publicly contradicted a central element of the Sussex narrative. Sources close to Harry describe a man who is genuinely conflicted. He does not want permanent conflict with his family, but he is also bound by public commitments and public statements that are very difficult to walk back without appearing to abandon everything he and Meghan said they left to protect. Sophie's remarks make that already difficult position harder, because if Sophie is now willing to go on record contradicting the Sussex account of events, it raises a question Harry cannot easily answer. How many other members of the royal family have stayed silent, not because they agreed with the narrative, but because they were exercising a restraint they are now slowly beginning to release? Inside the palace, the longer-term consequences of Sophie's decision are being assessed carefully. There are those who worry that opening this door, even slightly, creates a precedent that could be difficult to manage. The palace has always understood that its strongest protection against the Sussex narrative was institutional discipline. The moment that discipline develops visible cracks, the entire strategy requires reassessment. But there is another school of thought gaining ground, a view closely associated with William's broader vision for the institution. That view holds that the strategy of absolute silence was never sustainable in the long term. That an institution which requires its members to stay silent indefinitely in the face of public misrepresentation is asking too much of human nature and too little of its own credibility. that the monarchy's long-term relationship with the public depends not just on dignified restraint, but on a basic willingness to stand behind the truth when the truth is being visibly distorted. William has not said this publicly. He does not need to. His actions speak with sufficient clarity. He did not stop Sophie. He did not distance the palace from her remarks. And he has continued, in the weeks since, to say nothing that could be interpreted as a criticism of what she did. For Sophie herself, the aftermath has been navigated with the same composure that has characterized everything she has done in royal life. She has continued her public schedule without visible disruption. She has not elaborated publicly on what she said. She said what she needed to say in the context where she chose to say it, and has moved forward with the quiet confidence of someone who has no regrets. Sources close to her say she is at peace with it, that the years of silence had taken their own toll, that there is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from knowing something important and being unable to say it, and that the relief of finally speaking, even knowing the institutional turbulence it would create, was genuine and significant. She did not break her silence to attack Meghan. She broke it because she believed a specific thing that was false was being repeated as true. And she believed she was the right person, with the right knowledge, at the right moment, to correct it. Something has shifted. The rules of engagement have changed in a way that cannot be entirely undone, and the woman who changed them did it in the most Sophie way imaginable, quietly, precisely, without drama, and with complete conviction. Sophie did not hold a press conference. She did not release a statement. She simply told the truth in a room full of people and let it travel. In a family defined by carefully managed silence, that quiet act of correction may turn out to be the loudest thing she has ever done.